Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. We're stepping into the smoky halls and muddy courtyards of medieval Europe, where weddings weren't just about love or romance. They were about alliances, survival, and some of the strangest customs you've ever heard. From public bedding ceremonies to kidnapped brides, from ale-soaked feasts to livestock as wedding gifts, medieval weddings were wild, chaotic, and deeply bizarre. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start at the very beginning, long before any vows were spoken or rings exchanged. In medieval times, marriage wasn't something you stumbled into after a romantic courtship. It wasn't about butterflies in your stomach or stolen glances across a crowded room. Marriage was a transaction, a contract, a carefully negotiated deal between families. For peasants, marriage meant combining resources, two families merging their land, their livestock, their labor. It was about survival. If your father owned 3 goats and a small plot of barley, and the neighbor's daughter came with a cow and half an acre, well, that was a match made not in heaven, but in practical necessity. For nobles, the stakes were even higher. Marriages were political chess moves. A duke's daughter married to an earl's son could secure peace between warring territories. A princess wed to a foreign prince could forge alliances that prevented invasions. Love was irrelevant. What mattered was power, land, titles, and the continuation of bloodlines. The arrangement often began when the bride and groom were still children. Parents would meet, sometimes over ale in a drafty hall, sometimes through intermediaries who traveled between estates. They'd discuss dowries, the wealth or property the bride's family would provide. They'd negotiate the bride price, what the groom's family would pay in return. Every sheep, every silver coin, every acre of land was accounted for. The bride herself rarely had a say. She might be told one morning, over a bowl of thin porridge, that she was betrothed to a man she'd never met. Perhaps he lived 3 villages away. Perhaps he was twice her age. Perhaps he had a reputation for cruelty. It didn't matter. The deal was struck, the families had agreed, and her fate was sealed. The groom had slightly more agency, but not much. If he was the eldest son, his marriage was too important to leave to chance or personal preference. His father would choose a bride who brought the most advantage to the family. Only younger sons, those without inheritance, might have the luxury of marrying for affection. Betrothals could last years. A girl of 10 might be promised to a boy of 12, with the actual wedding delayed until she reached 14 or 15, the age when she was considered ready for marriage and childbearing. During this waiting period, the families remained bound by their agreement. Breaking a betrothal was scandalous and could lead to legal disputes, loss of dowry, or even violence between families. In some regions, the betrothal itself was almost as binding as marriage. A formal ceremony might take place where the couple exchanged gifts, a ring, a piece of cloth, a small token. Witnesses would be present to ensure the agreement was legitimate. From that moment, the couple was considered promised to each other in the eyes of the community and the church. The church, by the way, had complicated feelings about all this. On one hand, church law stated that marriage required the free consent of both parties. No one could be forced to marry against their will. On the other hand, the church also recognized the authority of parents and the importance of family alliances. So in practice, consent often meant simply not objecting loudly enough to stop the proceedings. There were stories, whispered in kitchens and around fires, of brides who refused. A girl who stood at the church door and said no, who ran away the night before her wedding, who chose a convent over a husband she despised. These women were rare and often paid dearly for their defiance. They might be disowned, beaten, or locked away until they agreed to comply. For most, resistance was futile. The weight of family expectation, economic necessity, and social pressure was too great. So they accepted their fate, these medieval brides and grooms, and prepared for a wedding that would bind them together for life, whether they liked it or not. The arrangement phase could be surprisingly detailed. Contracts were drawn up, sometimes on parchment, sometimes simply agreed upon verbally in front of witnesses. These contracts specified not just the dowry and bride price, but also what would happen if the marriage failed to produce children, if one spouse died, if the property needed to be divided. Negotiations could take months. Families haggled like merchants at a market. The bride's father might inflate the value of his land. The groom's father might downplay his son's prospects. Intermediaries, often local priests or respected elders, would mediate, trying to find terms both sides could accept. And through it all, the actual couple at the center of this arrangement might never speak to each other. They were pawns in a larger game, their personal feelings irrelevant to the machinery of medieval marriage. Once the betrothal was settled, attention turned to the dowry. This wasn't a gift in the modern sense. It was a crucial economic component of the marriage, a transfer of wealth that could make or break families. For peasant families, assembling a dowry was a years-long effort. A father might start setting aside resources from the moment his daughter was born, a few coins hidden in a jar, a young heifer kept separate from the rest of the herd, lengths of cloth woven during winter evenings. By the time the girl reached marriageable age, her dowry might include a small amount of money, some livestock, household goods like pots and blankets, and perhaps a tiny parcel of land. This wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Without a decent dowry, a girl's marriage prospects plummeted. She might end up with a much older man, a widower with children who needed a caretaker. Or she might not marry at all, becoming a burden on her family or forced into a convent. The dowry also served as the bride's security. In theory, it remained hers throughout the marriage. If her husband died, she could reclaim it. If the marriage was annulled, she took it with her. In practice, once the dowry was handed over, the husband controlled it, and getting it back could be nearly impossible. Noble dowries were staggering in their complexity and value. A duchess might bring entire estates, castles, titles, and the loyalty of hundreds of vassals. Her dowry could include gold and silver plate, jewels, fine fabrics, horses, and even the rights to collect taxes from certain territories. These transactions were recorded in elaborate documents, sealed with wax and witnessed by dozens of people. Lawyers and scribes would spend weeks ensuring every detail was correct. The transfer of such wealth could shift the balance of power in a region, which is why noble marriages were so carefully orchestrated. But dowries created problems too. Families could bankrupt themselves trying to provide adequate dowries for multiple daughters. A lord with 4 daughters faced a financial nightmare. He might have to sell land, borrow money, or arrange increasingly disadvantageous marriages for his younger girls. Some families tried to cheat. They'd promise a dowry of 100 silver marks but deliver only 70. They'd claim land was more fertile than it actually was. They'd include livestock that was old or sick. This led to disputes that could drag on for years, sometimes erupting into violence. The groom's family, meanwhile, was expected to provide the bride price or dower. This was property or money that would support the bride if she became a widow. It was meant to ensure she wouldn't be destitute if her husband died. The dower was typically about 1/3 of the husband's property, though this varied by region and social class. Negotiating the dower was just as contentious as negotiating the dowry. The groom's family wanted to promise as little as possible. The bride's family wanted to secure her future. Compromises were reached, often reluctantly, with both sides feeling they'd given up too much. In some parts of medieval Europe, there was also the morning gift, a present the groom gave his bride the morning after the wedding night. This was supposed to compensate her for her lost virginity and acknowledge the consummation of the marriage. The morning gift might be money, jewelry, or property, and it became the bride's personal possession. All these financial arrangements meant that medieval weddings were as much about economics as emotion. The ceremony itself was almost secondary to the transfer of wealth that accompanied it. Families rose or fell based on the marriages they arranged. A good match could secure prosperity for generations. A bad one could lead to ruin. For the bride, the dowry was a double-edged sword. It made her valuable, but it also made her a commodity. She was worth what she brought with her, and if that wasn't enough, She might be treated poorly by her new family. The pressure to justify her dowry, to prove she was worth the investment, followed her into her marriage and shaped how she was treated. And if a marriage failed to produce children, especially sons, the dowry could become a source of bitter resentment. The husband's family might feel cheated, having paid for a bride who didn't fulfill her primary purpose. The bride might be blamed, shamed, or even sent back to her family in disgrace. Though keeping her dowry was often legally complicated, the entire system was designed to bind families together through mutual economic interest. Once the dowry and dower were exchanged, both families had a stake in the marriage's success. Divorce was rare and difficult, partly because untangling the financial arrangements was such a nightmare. So the dowry wasn't just about money or property. It was about creating ties that couldn't easily be broken, ensuring that marriage was a permanent bond for better or worse. Once the financial arrangements were settled and the betrothal formalized, it was time to announce the upcoming wedding to the community. In medieval times, this wasn't done through printed invitations or social media posts. It was done through a practice called reading the banns. The banns were public announcements made in church on 3 consecutive Sundays or holy days before the wedding. The priest would stand before the congregation and declare that so-and-so intended to marry so-and-so, and if anyone knew of any reason why the marriage should not take place, they should speak now. This wasn't just ceremony. It served a crucial legal purpose. The church wanted to prevent invalid marriages, unions between people who were too closely related, people who were already married to someone else, or people who had taken religious vows. By announcing the marriage publicly, the church gave the community a chance to object. An object they did, sometimes. A man might stand up and declare that the groom was already married to his cousin in another village. A woman might reveal that the bride had secretly taken a vow of chastity. These objections had to be investigated, and if proven true, the marriage would be blocked. The reading of the banns also served a social function. It gave the community time to prepare for the wedding, to arrange gifts, to plan their attendance. In small villages where everyone knew everyone, a wedding was a major event, and people needed notice. For the couple, the reading of the banns made their upcoming marriage real in a new way. It was no longer just a private arrangement between families. It was public knowledge. The entire community now knew they were promised to each other, and backing out would be a public humiliation. In some regions, the announcement was accompanied by other traditions. The couple might walk through the village together for the first time, allowing people to see them as a pair. Neighbors might offer small gifts or words of advice. The bride's friends might tease her, singing songs about married life, some sweet, some bawdy. There was also the tradition of the bride ale, a party thrown by the bride's family where ale was brewed and sold to raise money for the couple. This was especially common among peasants who needed help financing the wedding. The entire village would come, drink, dance, and contribute what they could. It was part fundraiser, part celebration, and it helped integrate the couple into the community as a married pair. The announcement period could also be a time of anxiety. What if someone did object? What if a secret came to light? Brides and grooms who had anything to hide lived in fear during those 3 weeks between the first reading of the banns and the wedding day. There were stories of weddings stopped at the last moment, a previous spouse appearing out of nowhere, a revelation of forbidden kinship, a claim that one party had been coerced. These dramatic interruptions were rare, but they happened often enough to keep everyone on edge. For noble weddings, the announcement was even more elaborate. Heralds might be sent to neighboring estates to formally invite important guests. Letters would be written and sealed, carried by messengers on horseback. The announcement itself was a display of power and prestige, a way of showing the world that this alliance was significant. The church's insistence on public announcement was part of its effort to control marriage. Before the church fully regulated marriage, couples could simply declare themselves married, and if they consummated the union, it was considered valid. This led to all sorts of problems: disputed marriages, bigamy, abandoned spouses. By requiring banns, a church ceremony, and witnesses, the church made marriage a public, regulated institution. It couldn't be done in secret. It couldn't be easily denied or dissolved. Marriage became official, recorded, permanent, This shift gave the church enormous power over people's lives. It could decide who could marry and who couldn't. It could annul marriages or refuse to recognize them. It could punish those who violated its rules with excommunication or other penalties. For ordinary people, this meant their most intimate decisions were subject to church approval. They couldn't just marry who they wanted when they wanted. They had to follow the process, announce their intentions, wait for objections, and only then proceed to the actual wedding. The announcement period was also when final preparations intensified. The bride's family would be frantically finishing her trousseau, the collection of clothes and household items she'd bring to her new home. The groom's family would be preparing the house, making room for the new wife, ensuring there was space for her belongings. Food had to be gathered for the wedding feast. Animals might be slaughtered. Grain would be ground into flour for bread. Ale would be brewed in large quantities. Even a modest peasant wedding required significant resources, and the weeks between announcement and ceremony were a flurry of activity. The bride herself might be receiving instruction from older women, her mother, aunts, married friends. They'd tell her what to expect on her wedding night, though often in vague or euphemistic terms. They'd teach her about running a household, managing servants if she was noble, or doing the endless labor if she was a peasant. The groom, meanwhile, might be receiving his own advice from the men in his life. How to be a good husband, which mostly meant being a firm master of his household. How to manage his wife, his property, his responsibilities. The advice was often crude, practical, and focused on asserting authority. And through it all, the couple might still barely know each other. They might have met only a handful of times, always under supervision. Their wedding day would be the first time they were truly alone together, and that prospect was both exciting and terrifying. The days leading up to a medieval wedding were especially intense for the bride. She was about to leave her family, her home, everything familiar, and enter a new household where she might be a stranger. The preparation was both practical and emotional, a process of transformation from daughter to wife. For a peasant bride, preparation meant gathering her belongings. She didn't own much, a few changes of clothes, perhaps a blanket she'd woven herself, some small personal items. These would be bundled up, ready to be carried to her new home. She might also be finishing work on items for her trousseau, embroidering a shift, weaving a length of cloth, preparing things she'd need as a wife. Her mother and other women in the family would spend time with her, offering advice, sharing stories, preparing her for what was to come. Some of this advice was practical: how to manage a household, how to cook certain dishes, how to deal with a difficult mother-in-law. Some of it was more intimate, whispered conversations about the wedding night, about men, about the realities of married life. The night before the wedding, there might be a gathering of women, a sort of informal bridal shower. The bride's female friends and relatives would come together, bringing small gifts, sharing food and drink, offering support. There would be laughter and tears, bawdy jokes and sincere blessings. It was a moment of female solidarity before the bride entered the male-dominated world of marriage. For noble brides, the preparation was far more elaborate. She might spend weeks being fitted for new gowns, having her hair styled in new ways, learning the customs of her future household. If she was marrying into a foreign family, she might be learning a new language or studying the political landscape she was entering. Noble brides often had attendants, ladies-in-waiting who helped with every aspect of preparation. These women would dress her, style her hair, apply cosmetics, and accompany her throughout the wedding festivities. They were part entourage, part support system, part witnesses to ensure everything was done properly. The bride's clothing was significant. For peasants, she'd wear her best dress, often dyed a bright color like red or blue. White wasn't yet the standard for wedding dresses. That tradition came much later. The goal was to look festive and prosperous, to show that she was a valuable addition to her new family. Noble brides wore gowns of silk or fine wool, often in rich colors like crimson, gold, or deep blue. These dresses might be embroidered with gold thread, trimmed with fur, and accessorized with jewels. The bride's clothing was a display of her family's wealth and status, a visual statement of the alliance being formed. Hair was also important. Unmarried women typically wore their hair loose or in simple braids, a sign of their virginity. On her wedding day, a bride might wear her hair down one last time, often adorned with flowers or ribbons. After the wedding, she'd be expected to cover her hair, a sign of her married status. In some regions, there was a tradition of ritual bathing before the wedding. The bride would be washed by female relatives, a symbolic cleansing before she entered her new life. This bath might include herbs or flowers, and it was accompanied by songs and blessings. It was both practical, ensuring the bride was clean, and symbolic, washing away her old life. The bride might also receive gifts from her family, small tokens to take with her into her marriage, a piece of jewelry from her mother, a prayer book from her father, a lucky charm from a grandmother. These items were meant to provide comfort and connection to her family in her new home. Emotionally, this preparation period was difficult. The bride was saying goodbye to her childhood, her family, her independence. Even if she was excited about her marriage, there was grief in the leaving. She might never live in her family home again. She might see her parents and siblings only rarely. Her life was about to change completely, and there was no going back. Some brides were terrified. They'd heard stories of cruel husbands, difficult in-laws, the dangers of childbirth. They were being sent into the unknown with little control over their fate. The preparation period was their last chance to be surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally. Other brides were eager. Marriage meant adulthood, respect, a household of their own. It meant escape from the authority of their fathers. It meant the possibility of children, of building something new. For these women, the preparation was exciting, a countdown to a new beginning. But regardless of how they felt, the preparation was relentless. There was so much to do, so many details to manage. The bride had to be ready, physically and mentally, for the biggest transition of her life. And underlying all of it was the knowledge that once the wedding happened, there was no escape. Medieval marriage was for life. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulment required proving the marriage was invalid from the start, which was rare. So this preparation wasn't just for a wedding day. It was for a lifetime. While the bride was being prepared by the women in her life, the groom had his own preparations to make. These were often less emotionally fraught, but no less important. The groom was about to take on the role of husband, and in medieval society, that meant becoming the head of a household, a position of authority and responsibility. For a peasant groom, preparation meant ensuring he had a place for his new wife to live. If he still lived with his parents, space would need to be made. Perhaps a partition would be built in the family home, creating a small private area for the newlyweds. Or if he was fortunate, he might have his own cottage, modest but his own. He'd need to ensure there was enough food stored for the winter, enough fuel for the fire, enough resources to support a wife, and soon enough, children. This meant working extra hard in the months before the wedding, saving what he could, preparing for the increased responsibilities. The groom would also be receiving advice from the men in his life. His father, uncles, older brothers, married friends, they'd all have opinions on how to be a husband. Much of this advice was about asserting authority. A man must be master in his own home. He must not let his wife dominate him. He must be firm, but fair. There was also practical advice about managing a household, about working the land, about dealing with neighbors and lords. Marriage meant the groom was now a full adult in the eyes of the community, and he needed to act like it. For noble grooms, the preparation was more complex. He might be taking on not just a wife, but new lands, new vassals, new political responsibilities. He'd need to understand the terms of the marriage contract, what he was gaining, and what he was obligated to provide. Lawyers and advisors would brief him on the details. He might also be preparing his household to receive his bride. If she was coming from a distant place, arrangements would need to be made for her arrival. Rooms would be prepared. Servants would be instructed. Everything had to be ready to welcome her and her entourage. The groom's clothing was important too. Like the bride, he'd wear his finest garments. For a peasant, this might be a clean tunic and hose, perhaps a new belt or hat. For a noble, it would be rich fabrics, fine embroidery, perhaps a sword or other symbols of his status. In some regions, there were traditions involving the groom's friends. They might accompany him to the bride's house on the wedding day, a sort of medieval bachelor party procession. There would be drinking, singing, and general rowdiness. It was a way of marking the groom's transition from single man to husband. The night before the wedding, the groom might spend time with his male friends and relatives, a final evening of freedom before taking on the responsibilities of marriage. There would be drinking, storytelling, and advice, both serious and humorous. It was a bonding ritual, a way of affirming male solidarity. But the groom's preparation wasn't just about practical matters and social rituals. It was also about mental preparation. He was about to be bound to a woman he might barely know. He'd be responsible for her welfare, her behavior, her productivity. If she failed to produce children, especially sons, he'd be judged. If she proved difficult or disobedient, he'd be expected to control her. Medieval society placed enormous pressure on men to be successful husbands and fathers. A man who couldn't manage his household was mocked. A man whose wife was unfaithful was humiliated. A man who failed to produce heirs was pitied. The groom was stepping into a role that would define him for the rest of his life. Some grooms were excited. Marriage meant legitimacy, respect, the ability to build a legacy. It meant having a partner to share the burdens of life. It meant the possibility of love, though that was never guaranteed. Other grooms were anxious. What if his wife was unpleasant? What if they couldn't get along? What if she brought less to the marriage than promised? What if he couldn't fulfill his duties as a husband? These worries were real, and there was no backing out once the wedding happened. The groom also had to think about the wedding night. He was expected to consummate the marriage, to prove his manhood, and seal the union. This was a source of pressure, especially for young grooms who might be inexperienced. There were expectations, and failing to meet them could lead to gossip and shame. In some cultures, there were rituals to ensure the groom's virility. He might be given special foods or drinks believed to enhance performance. He might receive charms or blessings. All of this added to the pressure of an already stressful situation. The groom's preparation also involved financial matters. He needed to ensure he could afford the wedding feast, the gifts he was expected to give, the dower he'd promised. If he was in debt or financially unstable, this could be a source of great stress. For noble grooms, there might also be political considerations. His marriage could create new alliances or new enemies. He'd need to navigate these relationships carefully, ensuring he didn't offend anyone important. The wedding was as much a political event as a personal one, and through it all, the groom had to maintain an appearance of confidence and control. He couldn't show fear or doubt. He was about to become the head of a household, and he needed to look the part. Any sign of weakness could undermine his authority before his marriage even began. So the groom's preparation, while different from the bride's, was no less significant. He was preparing to take on a role that would shape the rest of his life, and the weight of that responsibility was heavy. The wedding day itself began with the church ceremony, though this wasn't always held inside the church building. In fact, for much of the medieval period, weddings took place at the church door, literally on the threshold between the secular world and the sacred space. The couple would gather at the church entrance, accompanied by their families, friends, and witnesses. The priest would stand before them, often on the church steps, and conduct the ceremony in full view of the community. This public setting was important. Marriage was not a private affair. It was a social contract that needed to be witnessed and acknowledged by everyone. The ceremony itself was relatively simple, especially compared to modern weddings. The priest would ask the couple if they consented to the marriage. This was the crucial moment. According to church law, both parties had to freely agree. The groom would be asked first, then the bride. Their answers had to be clear and unambiguous. In practice, of course, the consent was often more complicated. A bride who'd been pressured by her family might say yes even if she didn't want to. A groom who'd been threatened with disinheritance might agree even if he had doubts. But as long as they said the words, the church considered the marriage valid. After the consent, the couple would exchange vows. These weren't personalized vows like we have today. They were standard formulas, prescribed by the church. The groom would promise to take the bride as his wife, to love and honor her. The bride would promise to take the groom as her husband, to love, honor, and obey him. The obedience part was not optional for the bride. Then came the exchange of rings, if the couple could afford them. The ring was placed on the bride's finger, a symbol of the groom's commitment and the bride's new status as a married woman. The ring was blessed by the priest, making it a sacred object as well as a practical one. In some regions, there were additional rituals. The couple might join hands, their hands bound together with a ribbon or cord symbolizing their union. This is where we get the phrase, tying the knot. Or the groom might give the bride a coin or other token, representing his promise to provide for her. The priest would then bless the couple, asking God to grant them fertility, prosperity, and harmony. He might sprinkle them with holy water or make the sign of the cross over them. These blessings were meant to sanctify the marriage and protect it from evil. Once the ceremony at the church door was complete, the couple might then enter the church for a nuptial mass. This was more common for noble weddings than peasant ones. The mass was a full religious service with prayers, hymns, and communion. It could last an hour or more, and it was a way of emphasizing the sacred nature of the marriage. During the Mass, the couple might kneel before the altar, and a pall, a large cloth, would be held over them as a symbol of God's protection. They might receive communion together, their first act as a married couple. The priest would deliver a sermon about the duties of marriage, the importance of fidelity, and the need to produce children. For peasants, the nuptial Mass was often skipped. It was expensive, requiring donations to the church, and it took time that could be spent working. The ceremony at the church door was sufficient to make the marriage legal and binding. But whether the wedding included a Mass or not, the church ceremony was the moment when the couple became husband and wife in the eyes of God and the church. From this point on, they were bound together, and breaking that bond was nearly impossible. The church ceremony also served a legal function. The priest would record the marriage in the parish register, creating an official record. This was important for inheritance, for proving legitimacy of children, for all sorts of legal matters. Without this record, disputes could arise. Witnesses were crucial. The church required at least 2 witnesses to be present at the ceremony. These were usually family members or close friends, people who could testify that the marriage had taken place and that both parties had consented. In case of later disputes, these witnesses might be called upon to confirm what they'd seen and heard. The public nature of the ceremony also served to prevent clandestine marriages. Before the church regulated marriage, couples could marry in secret, and this led to all sorts of problems. By requiring a public ceremony with witnesses, the church made it much harder for people to deny or hide their marriages. For the couple, the church ceremony was a moment of profound transition. They were no longer individuals. They were a unit, a married couple, bound together by vows and blessed by God. Their lives were now intertwined, their fates linked. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And what happened next was usually a feast, a celebration that could last for hours or even days, depending on the wealth and status of the families involved. After the church ceremony, it was time to celebrate, and medieval people knew how to throw a party. The wedding feast was the highlight of the day, a chance for the community to come together, eat, drink, and make merry. It was also an opportunity for the families to display their wealth and generosity. For peasant weddings, the feast was a communal effort. Neighbors would contribute food and drink. Someone might bring a loaf of bread. Another might offer a cheese. A third might donate a chicken or a rabbit. The bride's family would provide the bulk of the food, but everyone pitched in. The feast would be held outdoors if the weather permitted, or in the largest available space, a barn, a village hall, or even just a cleared area in someone's yard. Tables and benches would be set up, or people would simply sit on the ground. There was no formal seating arrangement. You sat where you could find space. The food was simple but plentiful. Bread, cheese, roasted meat if they were lucky, stews made from vegetables and grains, pies filled with whatever was in season. The goal was abundance. A good wedding feast meant no one went home hungry. Drink was even more important than food. Ale flowed freely, brewed specially for the occasion. This was the bride ale we mentioned earlier, and it was strong, plentiful, and consumed with enthusiasm. By the end of the feast, most of the guests would be at least a little drunk, and some would be completely sotted. For noble weddings, the feast was a grand affair. It might be held in the great hall of a castle or manor house, with long tables set up and covered with fine linens. The food would be elaborate, multiple courses featuring roasted meats, game birds, fish, pastries, and sweets. Spices, which were expensive and exotic, would be used liberally to show off the family's wealth. Noble feasts could last for hours, with entertainment between courses. Musicians would play, jesters would perform. Poets might recite verses in honor of the couple. It was a spectacle, designed to impress the guests and demonstrate the family's status. Seating at a noble feast was carefully arranged according to rank. The bride and groom would sit at the high table, along with their parents and the most important guests. Everyone else would be seated according to their social standing, with the least important people at the far end of the hall. The feast was also a time for gift-giving. Guests would present gifts to the couple, usually practical items they'd need in their new life together. Household goods, tools, livestock, money if they could afford it. These gifts were announced publicly, and the generosity of each guest was noted and remembered. There were toasts, many toasts. People would stand and raise their cups, wishing the couple health, happiness, and fertility, especially fertility. The primary purpose of marriage was to produce children, and everyone would remind the couple of this duty, often in bawdy and explicit terms. The feast was also a time for music and dancing. Musicians would play lively tunes, and people would dance, often in circles or lines. The dances were energetic and communal, everyone participating together. The bride and groom would be expected to dance, even if they were exhausted or nervous. As the feast went on and the ale continued to flow, things could get rowdy. There might be singing, loud and off-key. There might be games, contests of strength or skill. There might be arguments, old grudges surfacing under the influence of alcohol. Fights were not uncommon at medieval weddings, but mostly the feast was joyful. It was a rare break from the hard work of daily life. People could relax, enjoy good food and drink, and celebrate something happy. Weddings were one of the few occasions when the whole community came together in a spirit of celebration. For the bride and groom, the feast was both wonderful and overwhelming. They were the center of attention, constantly being toasted, teased, and congratulated. They had to smile and be gracious, even as they grew tired and anxious about what was coming next. Because as the feast wore on and the sun began to set, everyone's thoughts turned to the bedding ceremony, the most bizarre and invasive tradition of the medieval wedding. If there's one medieval wedding tradition that makes modern people recoil in horror, it's the bedding ceremony. This was the practice of publicly escorting the bride and groom to their marriage bed, undressing them, and putting them to bed together, all while surrounded by a crowd of family and friends. Yes, you read that correctly. The couple's first night together was not private. It was a public spectacle. The bedding ceremony served several purposes. First, it ensured that the marriage was consummated. Consummation was essential for a marriage to be fully valid. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. So the community wanted to make sure the couple actually went to bed together. Second, it was a way of verifying the bride's virginity. The next morning, the bed sheets would be examined for blood, proof that the bride had been a virgin. This was especially important for noble families, where the legitimacy of heirs depended on the bride's purity. Third, it was simply tradition, a ritual that marked the transition from wedding celebration to married life. It was bawdy, embarrassing, and invasive, but it was what everyone expected. The bedding ceremony would begin as the feast was winding down. The bride's female friends and relatives would lead her to the bedchamber, singing songs, often with suggestive lyrics. They'd help her undress, removing her wedding gown, and putting her in a night shift or leaving her naked under the covers. Meanwhile, the groom's male friends and relatives would do the same for him, undressing him amid jokes and laughter. The men's songs were even more explicit than the women's, full of crude advice and innuendo. Once both bride and groom were in bed, The two groups would converge in the bedchamber. The room would be crowded with people, all offering advice, making jokes, and generally making the couple as uncomfortable as possible. A priest might be present to bless the bed and the couple. He'd sprinkle holy water and say prayers for fertility. This was meant to sanctify the act that was about to take place, to make it holy rather than sinful. Then, finally, the crowd would leave, though not always immediately. Some guests would linger, continuing to shout advice through the door or even peeking through keyholes. Privacy was not a medieval concept. For the couple, this was mortifying. They were expected to consummate their marriage while knowing that people were just outside, listening and waiting. The pressure was immense, especially for the groom, who had to perform under these circumstances. If the groom failed to consummate the marriage, it could be grounds for annulment. The bride could claim the marriage was invalid, and she might be allowed to marry someone else. This added even more pressure to an already stressful situation. The next morning, the bed sheets would be examined. If there was blood, it was celebrated as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. The sheets might even be displayed publicly, hung out a window for all to see. If there was no blood, the bride might be accused of not being a virgin, which could bring shame on her and her family. Of course, not all women bleed during their first sexual experience, and medieval people didn't understand this. So innocent brides could be wrongly accused, and there was little they could do to defend themselves. The bedding ceremony was less common among peasants than nobles. Peasant weddings were simpler, and there was less concern about proving virginity or ensuring consummation. The couple might simply retire to their home, and that would be that. But for nobles, the bedding ceremony was almost mandatory. Too much was at stake: titles, lands, alliances. The families needed to be sure the marriage was properly consummated and that any children born would be legitimate. Some couples tried to resist the bedding ceremony, asking for privacy, but this was often seen as suspicious. What were they trying to hide? Why didn't they want witnesses? The social pressure to comply was enormous. There are records of particularly invasive bedding ceremonies. In some cases, witnesses would actually stay in the room, hidden behind curtains or screens, to ensure the marriage was consummated. In other cases, the couple would be required to provide proof the next morning, not just blood on the sheets, but detailed accounts of what had happened. This level of intrusion seems unthinkable today, but in medieval times, marriage was not considered a private matter. It was a social contract, and the community had a right, even a duty, to ensure it was properly executed. For the bride especially, the bedding ceremony was traumatic. She was being publicly humiliated, stripped naked in front of people, and then expected to have sex with a man she might barely know, all while knowing people were listening outside the door. For the groom, it was also stressful, though in different ways. He had to prove his manhood, to perform on command. Failure would be humiliating and could have serious consequences. The bedding ceremony is one of the clearest examples of how different medieval attitudes toward privacy and sexuality were from our own. What we would consider a deeply intimate moment was, for them, a public event, witnessed and celebrated by the community. The morning after the wedding was almost as significant as the wedding day itself. This was when the marriage was confirmed, when the community verified that everything had gone as it should. The first order of business was examining the bed sheets. As we mentioned, blood on the sheets was considered proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. Female relatives, usually the bride's mother or mother-in-law, would inspect the sheets carefully. If blood was found, there would be celebration. The bride had been pure, the marriage was valid, and the couple could begin their life together with the community's blessing. The sheets might be displayed, hung from a window or carried through the village, a public announcement of the bride's virtue. If no blood was found, things could get ugly. The bride might be accused of not being a virgin, which was a serious charge. She could be sent back to her family in disgrace. The marriage might be annulled. Her reputation would be ruined, and her chances of ever marrying again would be slim. Of course, as we know now, not all women bleed during their first sexual experience. The hymen can be broken in many ways that have nothing to do with sex, or it might be elastic enough that it doesn't tear. But medieval people didn't understand this. They believed that all virgins bled, and the absence of blood was proof of prior sexual activity. Some brides, knowing this, would take precautions. They might hide a small vial of animal blood in the bed, to be released at the appropriate moment, or they might prick their finger and smear blood on the sheets. These deceptions were risky, but for a bride who knew she might not bleed naturally, they were necessary. After the sheet inspection, there was often a morning gift ceremony. The groom would present his bride with a gift, usually money or jewelry, as a token of his appreciation and a reward for her virginity. This gift became the bride's personal property, something she could keep, even if the marriage ended. The morning after was also when the couple would make their first public appearance as a married pair. They might attend church together, receiving a blessing from the priest. They might walk through the village, accepting congratulations from neighbors. This was their debut as husband and wife, and it was important to make a good impression. For noble couples, the morning after might include a formal breakfast with important guests. This was another opportunity to display wealth and hospitality. The couple would sit together at the high table, and everyone would toast their health and happiness. The morning after was also when reality began to set in. The celebration was over. The guests would go home, and the couple would be left to figure out how to actually live together. For many couples, this was the first time they'd been truly alone. During the betrothal period, they'd been supervised. During the wedding, they'd been surrounded by people. But now, it was just the two of them, and they had to learn how to be married. This could be awkward, especially if the couple didn't know each other well. They'd have to learn each other's habits, preferences, and moods. They'd have to figure out how to share space, how to make decisions together, how to navigate the inevitable conflicts. For the bride, the morning after marked the beginning of her new life. She was no longer part of her birth family. She belonged to her husband's family now. She'd have to learn their ways, adapt to their expectations, and find her place in their household. If she'd married into a household with a mother-in-law, this could be particularly challenging. The mother-in-law was often the real power in the household, and the new bride had to defer to her. Conflicts between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law were common and could make the bride's life miserable. For the groom, the morning after was when he truly became the head of his own household. He was responsible for his wife, for providing for her, for managing their home. This was a significant responsibility, and not all men were ready for it. The morning after was also when the couple would begin to think about the future. Would they have children? How many? How soon? These were not just personal questions, they were social and economic ones. Children were essential for continuing the family line, for providing labor, for ensuring security in old age. The pressure to produce children, especially sons, was immediate and intense. The couple's families would be watching, waiting for signs of pregnancy. If months passed without the bride conceiving, there would be whispers and worry. Was she barren? Was the marriage cursed? So the morning after was not a time of relaxation or romance. It was the beginning of a new set of pressures and expectations. The couple had to prove that their marriage was successful, and success was measured in very specific terms: consummation, fertility, and the production of heirs. Medieval wedding gifts were nothing like the registry items we give today. There were no toasters, no matching towel sets, no gift cards. Instead, gifts were practical, often agricultural, and sometimes downright strange. For peasant weddings, the most common gifts were livestock. A neighbor might give a chicken or a goose. A wealthier relative might contribute a piglet or even a calf. These animals were valuable, providing food, eggs, or labor. They were investments in the couple's future. Other common gifts included tools, a new hoe, a better plow, a sharp knife. These were essential for farming and household work. A couple starting out needed these items, and gifts from the community helped them get established. Household goods were also popular: a pot, a blanket, a length of cloth. These might not seem exciting, but they were necessary. A couple couldn't afford to buy everything they needed, so gifts filled the gaps. Sometimes gifts were more symbolic: a bag of seeds for planting, a bundle of firewood, a jar of honey. These represented wishes for prosperity, warmth, and sweetness in the marriage. For noble weddings, gifts were far more elaborate. Wealthy guests might give gold or silver plate, fine fabrics, jewels, or even land. These gifts were displays of the giver's wealth and status, as much as they were useful to the couple. Books were prized gifts for literate nobles. A beautifully illuminated prayer book or a collection of poetry could be a treasured possession. These gifts showed refinement and education. Horses were another common gift for nobles. A fine horse was both practical and prestigious. It could be used for travel, for hunting, or for war. A really exceptional horse could be worth a fortune. Some gifts came with strings attached. A lord might give a gift to a vassal who was marrying, but with the expectation of loyalty and service in return. Gifts were part of the complex web of obligations that held medieval society together. There were also traditional gifts that were considered essential. The bride's family would give her a trousseau, a collection of clothes, linens, and household items. This was her contribution to the new household, and it was expected to be substantial. The groom's family might give the couple furniture, a bed, a table, chairs. These were expensive items that the couple couldn't afford on their own. In some regions, there were specific traditions about what should be given. In parts of Germany, it was customary to give the couple a cow, symbolizing abundance and fertility. In parts of France, a gift of wine was traditional, representing joy and celebration. Some gifts were meant to ensure fertility: a basket of eggs, a pair of rabbits, anything that symbolized reproduction and abundance. The community wanted the couple to have many children, and gifts reflected this hope. There were also protective gifts, charms or amulets meant to ward off evil, a horseshoe for luck, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance and fidelity, a piece of iron to keep away fairies and evil spirits. Medieval people believed in magic and the supernatural, and they wanted to protect the newlyweds from harm. Gift-giving was also a way for the community to show support for the marriage. By giving gifts, people were saying, "We approve of this union. We want you to succeed. We're here to help." This social support was crucial in a world where survival often depended on community cooperation. The couple was expected to display their gifts at least for a while. This allowed everyone to see what they'd received and to judge the generosity of the givers. It was a form of social accounting, keeping track of who gave what and who might be expected to give more in the future. Some gifts were recycled. A pot given at one wedding might be given again at another. A blanket might make the rounds through several families. This wasn't considered cheap or inappropriate. It was practical. Resources were limited, and reusing items made sense. There were also traditions around when gifts should be given. Some were presented at the wedding feast. Others were brought to the couple's home in the days or weeks after the wedding. Some gifts were given privately, others publicly announced. The couple was expected to be gracious and grateful, no matter what they received. Even if a gift was small or not particularly useful, they had to accept it with thanks. Rejecting a gift or seeming ungrateful could offend the giver and damage relationships. In return, the couple might give small tokens to their guests: a piece of wedding cake, a ribbon, a small coin. These were mementos of the celebration, something for guests to take home and remember the day. The exchange of gifts was part of the larger social fabric of medieval life. It created bonds, established obligations, and reinforced community ties. A wedding wasn't just about two people. It was about two families, two networks of relationships coming together. And gifts were one way of making those connections tangible. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had established firm control over marriage. What had once been a largely secular affair, a contract between families, became a sacrament, a holy rite administered by the Church and subject to its laws. This shift gave the Church enormous power over people's lives. It could decide who could marry and who couldn't. It could annul marriages or refuse to recognize them. It could punish those who violated its rules. The Church's marriage laws were complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the Church insisted that marriage required the free consent of both parties. No one could be forced to marry against their will. This was a progressive idea for the time, and it gave individuals, especially women, at least some, protection against coercion. On the other hand, the Church also recognized the authority of parents and the importance of family alliances. So in practice, consent often meant simply not objecting loudly enough to stop the proceedings. A girl who said yes under pressure from her family was considered to have consented. The church also had rules about who could marry whom. You couldn't marry someone you were closely related to, and the definition of close relation was surprisingly broad. You couldn't marry anyone within 7 degrees of kinship, which included not just siblings and cousins, but also in-laws and even godparents. These rules were meant to prevent incest, but they also gave the church a tool for controlling marriage. If a marriage was politically inconvenient, the church could often find some distant kinship that made it invalid. Conversely, if a marriage was desirable, the church could grant a dispensation, allowing the couple to marry despite the kinship rules. The church also prohibited marriage during certain times of the year. You couldn't marry during Lent, the 40 days before Easter. You couldn't marry during Advent, the weeks before Christmas. You couldn't marry on certain holy days. These restrictions were meant to emphasize the sacred nature of marriage and to prevent it from being treated as a purely secular matter. Annulment was the church's version of divorce. The church didn't allow divorce. Marriage was supposed to be permanent, but it could declare that a marriage had never been valid in the first place. Grounds for annulment included non-consummation, coercion, kinship, or one party having taken religious vows. Getting an annulment was difficult and expensive. You had to petition the church, provide evidence, and often pay substantial fees. For ordinary people, annulment was out of reach. For nobles, it was a tool that could be used to escape unwanted marriages, though even they had to navigate a complex legal process. The church's control over marriage also extended to sexual behavior within marriage. The church taught that sex was only acceptable for the purpose of procreation. Sex for pleasure was sinful, even between married couples. There were rules about when married couples could have sex: no sex on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, or while breastfeeding. These rules were impossible to enforce, of course, but they created a climate of guilt and shame around sexuality. Married couples were made to feel that their natural desires were sinful, and this had lasting psychological effects. The church also taught that women were subordinate to men. The wife was to obey her husband in all things. This was based on biblical teachings, particularly the letters of St. Paul, which stated that wives should submit to their husbands as to the Lord. This teaching reinforced the patriarchal structure of medieval society. It gave husbands legal and moral authority over their wives. A woman who disobeyed her husband was not just being difficult, she was sinning against God. The church did teach that husbands should treat their wives with kindness and respect, but this was often ignored in practice. Domestic violence was common and rarely punished. A man who beat his wife might be criticized, but he was unlikely to face any real consequences. The church's marriage laws also addressed issues like adultery and bigamy. Adultery was a sin, and it could be grounds for separation, though not divorce. Bigamy, being married to 2 people at once, was a serious crime and could result in excommunication. Despite all these rules, many people in medieval Europe didn't follow them strictly. Peasants, in particular, often married without church involvement. They'd simply declare themselves married in front of witnesses, and that was that. The church tried to crack down on these informal marriages, but they persisted, especially in rural areas. The church's control over marriage was part of its broader effort to regulate all aspects of life. By making marriage a sacrament, the church inserted itself into the most intimate aspects of people's lives. It could dictate who you married, when you married, how you behaved within marriage, and whether you could ever escape a bad marriage. This control was resented by many, but it was also accepted as part of the natural order. The church was the ultimate authority on moral and spiritual matters, and marriage was both. So people submitted to its rules, even when those rules made their lives more difficult. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval marriage was the practice of child marriage. Girls as young as 12, and sometimes even younger, were married off to adult men. Boys could be married at 14. These weren't just betrothals, they were full marriages, often including consummation. The church set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These ages were based on the onset of puberty, the assumption being that once a person could physically reproduce, they were ready for marriage. The emotional, psychological, and social readiness for marriage was not considered. In practice, many marriages involved even younger children. Noble families, eager to secure alliances, would betroth their children as infants and marry them off as soon as they reached the minimum age, or sometimes before. These marriages were about politics and property, not about the well-being of the children involved. A girl of 12 was expected to leave her family, move into her husband's household, and begin producing children as soon as possible. The physical dangers of this were enormous. Childbirth was risky for adult women. It was even more dangerous for girls whose bodies were not fully developed. Many young brides died in childbirth or from complications of pregnancy. Others suffered permanent physical damage. But this was considered an acceptable risk. The need for heirs and the importance of political alliances outweighed concerns about the bride's health or life. For the girls themselves, child marriage was traumatic. They were torn from their families, married to men they didn't know, and expected to fulfill adult roles they weren't prepared for. They had no choice, no voice, no control over their own lives. Some child brides were married to much older men. A girl of 12 might be married to a man of 30, 40, or even older. These age gaps were not seen as problematic. In fact, they were often preferred. An older husband was more established, more able to provide for his young wife. But the power imbalance in these marriages was extreme. The young bride had no leverage, no experience, no ability to stand up for herself. She was completely dependent on her husband, and if he was cruel or abusive, she had no recourse. There were also cases of boys being married young, though this was less common. A boy of 14 might be married to secure an inheritance or an alliance. But boys had more options than girls. They could delay consummation, they could focus on their education or training, they could assert some control over their lives. Girls had no such options. Once married, they were expected to immediately take on the role of wife, which included sexual availability and childbearing. Their childhood was over, whether they were ready or not. The church was complicit in this practice. While it set minimum ages for marriage, it did nothing to discourage marriages at those minimum ages. It granted dispensations for even younger marriages when politically expedient. It prioritized the interests of powerful families over the welfare of children. There were a few voices of dissent. Some theologians argued that marriage should be delayed until both parties were more mature. Some parents tried to protect their daughters by delaying marriage, but these were exceptions. The norm was early marriage, especially for girls. The practice of child marriage had long-term effects on medieval society. It normalized the idea that girls were commodities, to be traded and used for the benefit of their families. It reinforced the subordination of women, who were married off before they had a chance to develop any independence or agency. It also contributed to high rates of maternal mortality. Young girls dying in childbirth was so common that it was barely remarked upon. It was just one of the risks of being female in the medieval world. Some child brides did manage to find happiness in their marriages. They grew to love their husbands. They had children who survived. They found fulfillment in their roles. But many others lived lives of quiet desperation, trapped in marriages they never wanted, bearing children they were too young to care for, dying before they reached adulthood themselves. The practice of child marriage is one of the darkest aspects of medieval life. It's a reminder that for all the romance and pageantry of medieval weddings, the reality was often brutal, especially for the most vulnerable members of society. If child marriage was disturbing, abduction marriage was downright horrifying. This was the practice of kidnapping a woman, often with the help of accomplices, and forcing her into marriage. It was more common than you might think, and it was often legal or at least tolerated. Abduction marriage, also known as bride capture or marriage by abduction, had ancient roots. In some cultures, it was a traditional way of acquiring a wife. A man who couldn't afford a bride price or who was rejected by a woman's family might simply take her by force. In medieval Europe, abduction marriage was technically illegal, but the laws were rarely enforced. If a man abducted a woman and managed to consummate the marriage, it was often considered valid. The woman's consent was assumed or simply ignored. The logic, such as it was, went like this. If a woman had been sexually compromised, she was no longer marriageable to anyone else, so she might as well marry her abductor. This protected her reputation and gave her a husband, even if he was a criminal. This logic, of course, completely ignored the woman's wishes and well-being. It prioritized social appearances over justice, and it gave men a perverse incentive to abduct women, knowing that if they succeeded, they'd likely get away with it. Abduction marriages were particularly common in areas where central authority was weak. In the borderlands, in remote rural areas, in times of war or social upheaval, men could abduct women with little fear of punishment. Sometimes abductions were planned with the help of the woman's family. A family that couldn't afford a dowry might arrange for their daughter to be abducted, allowing her to marry without the financial burden. This was a way of circumventing the normal marriage process, and while it was technically illegal, it was often winked at. Other times, abductions were genuine crimes. A man would see a woman he wanted, gather some friends, and take her by force. She might be dragged from her home, from a field where she was working, from a road where she was traveling. She'd be carried off, often to a remote location, and forced into marriage. The trauma of such an experience is hard to imagine. The woman would be terrified, violated, and then expected to accept her abductor as her husband. She'd have no legal recourse, no way to escape, no hope of justice. Some women resisted. They fought, they screamed, they tried to escape. But resistance was dangerous. An abductor who met with resistance might become violent, and even if a woman managed to escape, her reputation would be ruined. She'd been alone with a man, and that was enough to make her unmarriageable. The church officially condemned abduction marriage, but its condemnations were often toothless. If the marriage was consummated, the church would usually recognize it as valid. The woman might be encouraged to accept her fate and make the best of it. There were a few cases where abductors were punished. If the woman's family was powerful enough, they might seek revenge. If the abduction was particularly brazen or violent, local authorities might intervene. But these cases were rare. More often, abduction marriages were simply accepted. The woman would be married to her abductor, and life would go on. She might eventually come to accept her situation, or she might live in misery for the rest of her life. Abduction marriage is a stark reminder of how little power women had in medieval society. They could be taken, used, and forced into marriage, and there was little they could do about it. The law, the church, and society at large offered them almost no protection. It's also a reminder of how different medieval attitudes toward consent were from our own. The idea that a woman's consent was necessary for marriage was acknowledged in theory, but in practice, it was often ignored. What mattered was the interests of families, the preservation of social order, and the maintenance of male authority. Abduction marriage persisted in some parts of Europe well into the modern era. It wasn't fully eradicated until the 19th and 20th centuries, when women's rights movements began to challenge these practices and demand legal protections. But in the medieval period, abduction marriage was just one more way in which women were denied agency and autonomy. It was one more bizarre and brutal tradition that made medieval marriage a far cry from the romantic ideal we often imagine. Medieval marriage was supposed to be permanent. The church taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond that could not be broken. Divorce, as we understand it today, did not exist. Once you were married for life. But that doesn't mean there was no way out of a bad marriage. The church did allow for annulment, a declaration that a marriage had never been valid in the first place. If you could prove that your marriage was invalid from the start, you could be freed from it. The grounds for annulment were specific and limited. The most common was non-consummation. If a marriage had never been consummated, it could be annulled. This was based on the idea that consummation was what made a marriage complete. Without it, the marriage was incomplete and could be dissolved. Another ground for annulment was coercion. If one party had been forced into the marriage against their will, it could be annulled. But proving coercion was difficult. You had to show that you had objected at the time, that you had been threatened or physically forced. Simply saying you hadn't wanted to marry wasn't enough. Kinship was another common ground for annulment. If the couple was too closely related, the marriage was invalid. As we mentioned earlier, The church prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of kinship, and this rule could be used to annul marriages that were no longer wanted. Impotence was also grounds for annulment. If the husband was unable to consummate the marriage, the wife could petition for an annulment. This was humiliating for the husband, and it required proof, which could involve invasive examinations and testimony from witnesses. Prior marriage was another ground. If one party was already married to someone else, the second marriage was invalid. This was considered bigamy, a serious crime, and the bigamous marriage would be annulled. Religious vows were also a barrier to marriage. If one party had taken a vow of chastity, such as becoming a monk or nun, they couldn't marry. If they did, the marriage could be annulled. Getting an annulment was a complex and expensive process. You had to petition the church, usually through an ecclesiastical court. You had to provide evidence, which might include testimony from witnesses, documents, and even physical examinations. You had to pay fees, which could be substantial. For ordinary people, annulment was out of reach. They couldn't afford the fees. They didn't have access to lawyers, and they didn't have the social connections to navigate the church bureaucracy. So they were stuck in their marriages, no matter how unhappy. For nobles, annulment was a tool that could be used to escape unwanted marriages. If a marriage was no longer politically useful, or if a better match came along, a noble might seek an annulment. They'd find some ground, kinship was often convenient, and petition the church. The church was often willing to grant annulments to powerful people. It didn't want to alienate the nobility, and it could be persuaded by donations or political pressure. So nobles could often get annulments, while peasants could not. This created a two-tiered system. The rich and powerful could escape bad marriages. The poor and powerless were trapped. It was yet another way in which medieval society favored the elite at the expense of everyone else. Even when an annulment was granted, it could create problems. What happened to any children from the marriage? Were they legitimate or illegitimate? What happened to the dowry and dower? Who got the property? These questions had to be resolved, and they often led to further disputes. Some people tried to escape bad marriages without going through the annulment process. They simply left. A man might abandon his wife and move to another town. A woman might run away and seek refuge in a convent. These informal separations were not legal, but they happened. The church also allowed for legal separation in some cases. If a marriage was unbearable, if there was abuse or adultery, the couple could be granted a separation. They'd live apart, but they'd still be married. They couldn't remarry, but at least they didn't have to live together. This was called separation from bed and board, and it was the closest thing to divorce that medieval people had. It wasn't ideal, but for some, it was better than staying in a dangerous or miserable marriage. The church's refusal to allow divorce was based on biblical teachings, particularly Jesus' statement that what God has joined together, let no man separate. The church took this literally, insisting that marriage was indissoluble. But this teaching caused enormous suffering. People trapped in abusive marriages had no escape. People who had made mistakes in their youth were stuck with the consequences for life. People who simply grew apart or fell out of love had to stay together anyway. The permanence of marriage was meant to encourage people to take it seriously, to work through problems, to honor their commitments. But it also meant that many people lived in quiet desperation, bound to partners they didn't love, couldn't stand, or even feared. The medieval approach to marriage, with its emphasis on permanence and its limited options for escape, shaped attitudes toward marriage for centuries. It wasn't until the modern era that divorce became widely available, and even then, it remained controversial and difficult. As we reach the end of our journey through the bizarre traditions of medieval weddings, it's worth reflecting on what all of this tells us about medieval society and about marriage itself. Medieval weddings were not romantic affairs. They were practical, political, and often brutal. They were about alliances, property, and the continuation of family lines. Love, if it came at all, came later, after the wedding, after the couple had learned to live together. The traditions we've explored, the arranged marriages, the dowries, the public bedding ceremonies, the child marriages, the abductions, all of these reflect a society that valued order, hierarchy, and male authority above individual happiness or freedom. Women, in particular, had little control over their own lives. They were married off young, often to men they didn't know. They were expected to be obedient, to produce children, and to accept their lot without complaint. Their consent was theoretically required, but in practice it was often ignored or coerced. Men had more power, but they too were constrained by social expectations. They had to marry to be considered full adults. They had to provide for their families. They had to produce heirs. The pressure to fulfill these roles was intense. The church played a central role in medieval marriage, regulating who could marry, when they could marry, and how they should behave within marriage. The church's teachings emphasized the sacred nature of marriage, but they also reinforced patriarchal structures and limited people's options for escape from bad marriages. Despite all of this, medieval people did find ways to make their marriages work. Some couples grew to love each other. Some found companionship and partnership. Some built happy families and successful households. Marriage was hard, but it wasn't always miserable. The traditions we've explored also had their positive aspects. The communal nature of medieval weddings, with the entire village participating, created a sense of social cohesion. The exchange of gifts and the shared feast reinforced community bonds. The public nature of the ceremony ensured that marriages were recognized and supported. And some of the traditions, stripped of their more problematic elements, have survived into the modern era. We still exchange rings, still have wedding feasts, still celebrate with music and dancing. The forms have changed, but the basic idea of marking a marriage with a public celebration remains. But we've also moved away from many medieval practices, and that's a good thing. We no longer arrange marriages for children. We no longer treat women as property to be traded. We no longer force couples to consummate their marriages in front of witnesses. We've recognized that marriage should be based on consent, on mutual respect, on love. The history of medieval marriage is a reminder of how far we've come. It's also a reminder that the traditions we take for granted, the idea that people should choose their own partners, that marriage should be based on love, that both parties should have equal rights, these are relatively recent developments. For most of human history, marriage was very different. Studying medieval weddings also helps us understand the origins of some of our current traditions. The white wedding dress, the exchange of rings, the wedding cake, the honeymoon, all of these have roots in medieval practices, even if they've evolved significantly over time. It also helps us appreciate the complexity of medieval society. These weren't simple or primitive people. They had elaborate legal systems, complex social structures, and rich cultural traditions. Their approach to marriage was different from ours, but it made sense within their context. Medieval people were trying to solve real problems: how to create stable families, how to transfer property across generations, how to form alliances, how to ensure the survival of their communities. Their solutions seem strange to us, but they were rational responses to the challenges they faced. Of course, that doesn't mean we should romanticize medieval marriage or excuse its injustices. The suffering caused by forced marriages, child marriages, and abduction marriages was real and profound. The lack of options for people trapped in bad marriages was a serious problem. The subordination of women was unjust. But understanding these practices helps us see how marriage has evolved and why the changes we've made matter. Every time we affirm that marriage should be based on consent, we're rejecting the medieval practice of arranged marriage. Every time we insist on equality within marriage, we're challenging the patriarchal structures of the past. The bizarre traditions of medieval weddings are part of our history, part of the long and complicated story of how humans have organized their intimate lives. They're a reminder that what seems natural or inevitable about marriage is actually the product of specific historical circumstances. And they're a reminder that traditions can change. What was once considered normal and necessary, public bedding ceremonies, child marriage, abduction marriage, is now seen as bizarre and unacceptable. This gives us hope that we can continue to evolve, to create forms of marriage that are more just, more equal, more based on genuine choice and mutual respect. So as we close this chapter on medieval weddings, let's appreciate the strangeness of the past, learn from its mistakes, and be grateful for the progress we've made. And let's remember that the story of marriage is still being written, and we all have a role in shaping what comes next. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the bizarre traditions of medieval weddings. I hope you've learned something, been entertained, and maybe even been a little shocked. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to explore. Until next time, sleep well and be glad you weren't born in the Middle Ages.